Hello, Palmetto family. It is so good to see you again this week. We are excited to bring you another podcast as we continue our series in Romans. Last week, we looked at Romans 1:16 through 17, and it was Paul's thesis that the gospel is the power of God for salvation. And this week, Paul starts laying out the problem the gospel solves, and he begins with the word wrath. And so I want to read from Romans chapter 1, verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. So Mike, this word wrath, it kind of, I think, scorched earth here. What does it mean when it says that God's wrath is being revealed?
Yeah, it's a good question. When we think of wrath, and like you said, we think of human wrath, right? We think, you said scorched earth? Mm-hmm. I like that. It's kind of an ominous word, and many people picture God's wrath as being something that is scorched earth. But here in Romans chapter 1 is something very different because it's not scorched earth, it's redemptive. In other words, it's not punitive wrath, it is redemptive wrath. And so let me explain a little bit what I mean. As you said, Romans 1:16 is kind of the thesis for the entire letter to the Romans. It's about how the gospel is the power, God's power to save for everyone. Now, before you know the need for the cure, you have to know that you have disease. So while it is salvation for everyone has to come under condemnation first. You have to realize condemnation before you can grasp grace. And so that's what this is all about. And by the way, as a way of background, you remember that this church is made up of Jews and Gentiles, little house churches scattered across Rome. And one of the things Paul's going to show them, because they had sometimes had difficulty, Jews and Gentiles getting together, working together, he's going to show them how the gospel is the great equalizer. And the first way he does that is to show, listen, whether you are Jew or Gentile, you are in the same boat, even as the pagans, in terms of you can't stand before God based on your own righteousness. And so the way he starts this to show that we all have a problem is it begins by talking about the wrath of God being revealed against unrighteousness. And it's important to note, he doesn't say it will be revealed. It's not future tense here. He says the wrath of God is being revealed. So that makes you say, how? How is the wrath of God being revealed? Well, there's a phrase that's over and over in that first chapter, and it's a phrase, God gave them over. I believe 3 times Paul uses that. God gave them over, for instance, to sinful lust. Now, when you think about God giving them over, what in the world does that mean? Well, I think of the prodigal son, for instance, the story of where the father allows the prodigal son to go his way, partly in order for him to learn his lesson of what life without dad is like. I think of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where the Apostle Paul tells them there's an immoral man in their midst, and they tell him to hand him over to Satan so that he might come back to God. So there is a sense in which God hands us over. If we want to do life without him, he will hand us over to that. In fact, what you see in Romans chapter 1 is this great spiral that starts with the exchange, where Paul says they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, which is what sin is, by the way. Sin is always exchanging the true God for something else, for a false God, whatever that might be, which then leads to that spiral. If you choose to exchange God, God will let you do that. He will give you what you want. If you want life without him, then he'll give you what you want in order for you to experience what that emptiness of life is like. But remember the goal of God's wrath in that way, of him withdrawing his presence, his restraint, in order for you to have that downward spiral, is so that you'll come back to him. And of course, he gives a number of examples there in chapter 1 about people, that downward spiral, especially sexually. He talks about that, about men abandoning natural relationships with women in the same way women abandoning natural relationships with men. He's talking about what life looks like when you abandon God and you start to live by your own rules. We're supposed to be imagers of God, but when you turn that mirror away from God and you start imaging something else, that's when that downward spiral happens. And so that's something we're going a little bit deeper in now that I'm not able to next Sunday, because whenever you do a sermon, you're not able to go as deeply into it. And it's part of what this is all about, by the way, is going a little bit deeper. But we need to see that Paul's whole point here is, number one, to say we're all under condemnation. Everyone needs Christ, because the moment the Jews and Gentiles in the church are, yeah, let them pagans have it. In chapter 2, he says, well, let me talk to you now, you who would judge another. Let me talk to you guys who have the law. And then he goes on with this kind of like a courtroom banter. We're all in, there's no one good. No one seeks God. And it's all coming down to the point to say, we all need the gospel. But back to your original point, the wrath of God here, don't think about it in terms of God is out of control. That's not the way biblical picture of wrath. It is his divine judgment about anything that harms his good creation. That's what wrath is in Scripture.
Well, really appreciate that. And as you see on the screen, we have some follow-up questions for you to be able to use at home with your spouse or with your life group. And so we are so thankful that you have chosen this time to get a little bit deeper, as you said, to kind of get the outtake, the deeper look into the scriptures that we aren't always able to do on Sunday morning. And so we look forward to having another time with you next week, and may you have a blessed week.